Hey everyone, welcome back to another tier list. Today we're going to be going through the discography of the legendary band Soundgarden. Soundgarden has always been a band that is near and dear to my heart. Ever since I was a kid growing up in the 90s, they were always a group that I thought had a particularly unique sound, and they really pushed the envelope musically and gave us some of the most memorable songs and albums of the 90s, in my opinion. And whenever I think about the grunge genre and I look at the typical bands that are sort of like the poster boys for grunge music, Soundgarden is always at the top of my list. So I'm very excited to be covering them for this video, and what I'm going to be doing is I will go through all 6 of their studio albums from Ultra Mega OK up to King Animal, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, give you some background information, and let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree, where you disagree, and how you would rank their 6 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album released on Halloween of 1988, titled Ultra Mega OK, and unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a C. I've always struggled with this album because there are some things that I do enjoy about it. It has a handful of songs that I do think are great, but it also does contain a large chunk that has never really resonated with me, and I think stylistically, this one is a bit too scattered and lacks the consistency and cohesion that some of their later albums would have. This original lineup of Soundgarden would have Chris Cornell on vocals and guitar, Kim Thayil on guitar, Matt Cameron on drums, and the bassist is Hiro Yamamoto, who would only be the bassist for their first 2 albums. Compositionally, this one is much more collaborative, with a lot of musical contributions from each member of the group. It features a mix of songs, with some that were written during the making of their debut 1987 EP titled Screaming Life, and in addition to that, we have a couple of songs that are even older than that, and a couple of newer tracks as well. The album opens up with the lead single titled Flower, and I really enjoy this song, and I do consider it to be one of the high points of the album. It definitely contains all of the elements that I love about Soundgarden's sound, with the hard-hitting guitar riffs and dropped D tuning, and the nice hard-hitting vocals from Chris. I will say, though, I think that his voice evolves and becomes even better as the band develops their sound more and more in future albums, but nevertheless, this is certainly a great opener to the album. And then we have a track called All Your Lies, which was originally released on a 1986 compilation album of 6 different Seattle rock bands, and it was called Deep Six. Another song that I like, I wouldn't say that it's a favorite from this album, but I do think that it is a relatively strong follow-up song to the opener. So I do find that the opening 2 tracks of this album are pretty strong, and now from this point on, here are where the songs start to sort of dip in momentum here and there and start to lose me a little bit, starting with track 3, which is titled 665, written by the bassist Hiro Yamamoto. This song takes on a more experimental route, and if I'm in the right mood to listen to something like this, it can be a cool experience, but I think in the context of this album and in the broader context of the Soundgarden sound, this track has always felt a little bit out of place for me. But also, to be fair, this is their first album and they're trying to find their sound, so that's why we're getting a lot of stylistic variation throughout the album, but at the same time, that is what contributes so much to the sort of lack of cohesion that I said at the beginning that I feel like this album is missing. But then after that, luckily, we have my favorite song from this album, titled Beyond the Wheel. To me, this is the most badass and hard-hitting song of the early Soundgarden period. It contains all of the elements that I love about Soundgarden, the slow tempo grooves with these dark and ominous guitar parts, and Chris's vocals going from really low to really high ranges in such an effortless way. A very cool guitar solo from Kim as well. Just an all-around amazing song, and easily the high point of this album for me. Then we go into another Yamamoto song, a short 56-second track titled 667. Once again, sort of a skip-over track for me, and I feel bad because I feel like a lot of the low points on this album are because of these Yamamoto tracks, but at the same time, if I was listening to these songs in the right context, they could definitely be enjoyable because there is some cool stuff going on within these tracks from an experimental perspective. But I think in terms of the overall just momentum of the album, it just takes away from it too much, unfortunately. And then that track is followed by a newer Chris Cornell song titled Mood for Trouble. I don't find this song particularly exciting. It doesn't do much for me. I do think the drum groove is very cool on the opening section, but compared to the other Chris track that we heard so far with Beyond the Wheel, I think that one is much more exciting and engaging. After that, the energy comes up a lot with a Kim track titled Circle of Power, the only song on this album also where Kim does lead vocals, providing another contrast in sound from the other things that we've heard thus far, but I really do enjoy his vocals, and I think this song has a really good energy to it. The guitar riffs are really cool. It brings a nice burst of energy into the middle of the album. One of the better songs of the second half of the album, in my opinion. And then that is followed by the one Matt Cameron song on here titled He Didn't. Not a bad song, but also not a song that I would say really stands out in any exceptional way. And basically from track 5 onward, that's how I feel throughout the remainder of this album. Whenever there is a song that I do like, I may like it, but I don't think it's one of the standout tracks from the Soundgarden discography. That's kind of a general feeling throughout the remainder of this. After that, we have a cover of the classic Howlin' Wolf blues song titled Smokestack Lightning, and they put their own little spin on it, and it does sound cool, but it's just not really a song that I'm particularly interested in hearing Soundgarden cover. I know some people like this song a lot, and that's fine, but for me, it's just never really resonated with me, and once again, sort of a skip-over track. And originally, it was put in place of another track titled Toy Box, and ultimately, Chris didn't end up being happy with that decision, and I do agree with him on that. I would have preferred Toy Box in place of this. Then we have another newer track, and the final one written by Yamamoto titled Nazi Driver. Definitely the best Yamamoto song on this album, and the one that I would say is the most compatible with the Soundgarden sound. And I think if his other two tracks were more kind of stylistically in that vein, it could have added a lot to this album. Then we bring the energy up with Head Injury, and to me, this is the standout track of the last chunk of the album. I really enjoy this song. And then that is followed by a Kim song titled Incessant Mace, a song that sounds a lot like it could have been influenced by Black Sabbath, at least in terms of the guitar parts. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, but definitely not a bad song to conclude the album with. But I do think that it is a tad long and does drag on a little bit much. And then after that, they conclude the album with 1 minute of silence, throwing a little tribute to John Lennon and Yoko Ono, who were big influences on Chris, in addition to the Beatles as well. So as you can see, for me, there are a couple of really good tracks scattered in between a lot of skip-over tracks and mood changes that I don't think translate into the most coherent album, but there still are some great moments that give us hints of that amazing Soundgarden sound that will come. So not an amazing first release, but not the worst thing that they could have put out. I'll give this one a C. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1989 titled Louder Than Love, and I'll give this one a B. I do consider this one to be an upgrade from the first release. I think that it has a more cohesive feel throughout, and I don't think that there are as many dips in momentum or as many skip-over tracks as Ultra Mega OK, but at the same time, I don't think that the majority of the songs on this album are really standout, exceptional tracks from the Soundgarden catalog, with the exception of a couple that I do really like. But I still wouldn't say that the good songs from this album stand up as well as the good songs from some of their future albums. And this was also the last album to feature Hiro Yamamoto on bass, and he would contribute musically to 3 songs on here. It opens up with Ugly Truth, which I would say is an okay song, but I don't think it's the most hard-hitting and engaging opening track that they could have picked to start out the album. And I do think that it gets a little bit long and repetitious. I do think that Flower from Ultra Mega OK is a stronger opener than this one if we were going to compare the two. And everything I just said about the opening track, I feel the same way about track 2, Hands All Over. I know this was one of the singles from the album, and a lot of people regard this as one of their favorites, but for whatever reason, I've just never found this song to be that exciting, and I really have tried. I've listened to it a bunch of times, and it just never clicked with me for some reason. I do think that the momentum does pick up a bit, though, with track 3 titled Gun. This one has some great guitar work, cool mixing of different time signatures, and a great guitar solo as well. I really love Soundgarden's ability to write these hard-hitting songs at these slower tempos, and I think a song like this is also a great example of that. Then we have one of 3 tracks with music written by Yamamoto. The first one is called Power Trip, and I really enjoy this song. I love the dark and ominous energy of it. The guitar riffs are very tasteful, and in general, I think Yamamoto's contributions to this album are all very strong and only enhance the album. So very different from the first release, and one thing that I will say is a big improvement in this album, in my opinion. After that, we have Get on the Snake, which has music written by Kim. This one is a good pickup in energy from the previous 2 tracks, some cool guitar and vocal parts as well, some really interesting odd meter phrases thrown in with some of the riffs. And although I did enjoy the past 3 songs that we just talked about, like I said at the beginning, I don't think that any of these are really exceptional or standout tracks from Soundgarden's discography, but I wouldn't say that they're skip-over tracks either, so I'm sort of in the middle on a lot of these songs. After that, though, we have my second favorite song from the album, titled Full On Kevin's Mom. I love the fast-paced guitar riffs. This one almost has like a thrash metal sound to it and showcases some of their early punk influences. And I absolutely love hearing that side of them. Great vocal layering as well, and it really makes those heavy guitar parts pop even more. So in my opinion, this song is the high point of the first half of the album. And then we have the second single of the album, titled Loud Love. I do like this one a lot as well. I think it's got some really tasty guitar grooves and an amazing vocal performance from Chris. And then we change gears. We go into sort of a spacey and experimental metal track called I Awake, another one with music written by Yamamoto. And I think this one is also very cool and hits really hard. And I think it's a perfect combination of the heavier, metal aspects that we get from Soundgarden's sound combined with some of that experimental stuff that Yamamoto was doing on the first album. I think he found a really perfect balance within this track. And I think if he had written more stuff like this on the first release, it would have enhanced that album a lot more. Then we have the third and final song from this album that Yamamoto wrote music for. It's titled No Wrong, No Right. And believe it or not, this is hands down my favorite song from this album. I think this is a criminally underrated Soundgarden song. It's just got such a cool dark vibe to it with really interesting bass parts and a really haunting vocal melody. I think I would say of the first 2 Soundgarden albums, this has got to be my favorite song from the first 2 releases. I would probably even put it in my top 10 to top 15 favorite Soundgarden tracks. That's how much I like it. I'm curious if anybody else feels the same way, because I feel like most people don't even talk about this song, but I just think it's perfect. Then the next track is titled Uncovered, and this is probably my least favorite song on the album. I just find it kind of boring. It's always been a skip-over track for me. And the song that follows that is titled Big Dumb Sex. I think this one has some cool guitar and bass harmonies, as well as the vocal layers on the octave parts. A little bit more of the bluesy hard rock side. And while I don't think this one is a bad song, I also wouldn't say it's one of the standout tracks from this album either. And then the album concludes with Full On, which I think is kind of a weak closer. I've never found it that intriguing, and to me it just kind of sounds like a thrown together quick little jam session. I think Incessant Mace from the previous album was a stronger closer, and that's generally the sentiment that I feel when I compare these first 2 albums. I think the first album had stronger opening and closing tracks, but I think stylistically and track to track, Louder Than Love, it's much more consistent and has a more cohesive vibe throughout, in addition to having stronger song contributions from Yamamoto. But at the same time, I don't think a lot of the songs on Louder Than Love really stand out or are exceptional tracks, other than No Wrong, No Right and Full On Kevin's Mom. But regardless, I do think that this album does have a handful of really enjoyable tracks, and it definitely further expanded on some of the sound that they had developed on their first release, and create a nice foundation for them to continue to build and expand their sound off of on future albums. So I would say that this is an okay album. I'll give this one a B. All right, we continue with their third studio album from 1991 titled Badmotorfinger, and not surprising, I'm going to give this one an S. Absolutely amazing album, and the first release where they have really settled and established their sound that they had been developing throughout their first 2 releases. This would be the first album to feature what is regarded as the classic Soundgarden lineup with Chris, Kim, Matt, and now Ben Shepherd on bass. Musically, this one definitely reaches new levels of complexity and uniqueness with more odd time signatures, more exotic riffs, and more interesting chord progressions, with a lot of that due to the fact that Chris was experimenting with more alternate tunings, which added a whole nother layer of depth to the guitar parts. And this album was released around the same time as Nirvana's Nevermind and Pearl Jam's 10, which really helped to propel the grunge and alternative rock movement into the mainstream. So it was a very exciting time for Soundgarden, and this album ended up becoming their highest charting album at the time, reaching number 39 on the Billboard 200. It opens up about as strong as any album can open up, with two classic hits back-to-back, Rusty Cage and Outshined, two absolutely incredible Chris Cornell compositions. Rusty Cage gives us that perfect hard-hitting banger to open things up. Great guitar riffs, very interesting rhythmically, and the breakdown part in the bridge is a great example of some of the musical intricacies that we start to hear throughout this album. And then Outshined could not be a better follow-up track. It has a slightly slower tempo, but equally as badass and hard-hitting, with another odd meter riff. This time we're in 7. And I've always particularly loved the contrast in sections within this song. When that second section comes in, those opening chords just provide such a little pretty detour from the opening section, a technique that I think Soundgarden does exceptionally well within their music and their writing. Then we have another hard-hitting mid-tempo track titled Slaves and Bulldozers, and it's quite the task to try to follow up those incredible two opening tracks, but I think this song does a good job of it. And it's also their longest song of any studio album up to this point, clocking in at almost 7 minutes. Then we have another one of the classic hits from this album, Jesus Christ Pose, and this would probably be my favorite track from this album, although it is a hard choice to narrow it down to one. This song just goes so hard, one of the most intense energies of any Soundgarden song, in my opinion. I love the drum parts and the minimal use of cymbals in the first half and how they go against those guitar riffs. And a little fun fact, this is one of only a few songs where everyone received a writing credit, so a great collaborative piece from everybody. After that, we have two Ben Shepherd tracks titled Face Pollution and Somewhere. Both very cool songs. Face Pollution is a nice groovy song with a great drive to it, and it provides a nice contrast from Jesus Christ Pose. And Somewhere is a cool song in 6. I love the way the guitar part goes against the vocal melody in the second section, and the energy getting brought up for the final instrumental section is very tasteful. Really good contributions from Ben Shepherd. Then we have another Cornell track titled Searching with My Good Eye Closed. Really awesome song, and a great example of the down-tuned guitar stuff that Chris was exploring, tuning the low E string all the way down to B, which actually makes it sound more like a 7-string guitar. It added such a nice heaviness and an extra layer of depth to the guitar parts on this album. Then we go into a hard-hitting and badass Matt Cameron and Kim song titled Room 1,000 Years Wide. Definitely my favorite track from the second half of the album, one of my favorite guitar riffs. Such an eerie and ominous lower vocal part as well from Chris. Really tasteful song. And then after that, we have another Chris song called Mind Riot. A very interesting song, which I would say probably has more of a different feel from everything else that we've heard so far, and I think it contrasts everything else that we've heard very nicely. Then we go into another Matt Cameron song titled Drawing Flies, another riff in 6 with almost bluesy sorts of undertones to it, and surprisingly a little bit of saxophone on it as well. Very cool song, and again, a song with a nice contrast from everything else that we heard up to this point. Then we have Holy Water, which is a really nice groovy Chris Cornell track with very tasteful guitar parts and awesome vocal melodies. Some great changes going on in the guitars in the second half of the song too, where the mood gets a bit darker. I really like that contrast. And then the album concludes with New Damage, a song written by Kim and Matt with a really unique riff in 9. A great example of Chris's amazing ability to write really natural sounding vocal melodies over odd time signatures. And that riff really serves as the foundation for most of the song, and I really love the way that they pick up the energy for the final minute. A very hard-hitting and satisfying way to conclude this amazing album. So as you can see, I don't really have a bad thing to say about this album. I love every single song. It doesn't have one skip-over track for me. My two favorites have got to be Jesus Christ Pose and either Outshined or Room 1,000 Years Wide. Really tough choice. But like I said, I think they really came into their own on this album and fully established what we would come to know as that classic Soundgarden sound. So I cannot say enough good things about this album. This one gets an easy S. All right, now we have their fourth studio album from 1994 titled Superunknown. And to me, this one is a no-brainer. This one gets an S. And this is by far my favorite Soundgarden album. I know it's a cliche choice, but I really think that this is a perfect album. And for me, this would probably even make my top 3 favorite 90s albums list as well. I think that what they did on here that was so great was they took the amazing sound that they had established on Badmotorfinger and just continued to expand on it and build more and more interesting material and continued to push the boundaries of what we had known from 90s rock music. I think collectively it features some of the best individual tracks that each member has contributed to the group, and I think the combination of that with Chris's extreme perfectionism and meticulousness while writing and recording this album resulted, in my opinion, the best grunge album of all time. And this did end up being the album that would give them their first #1 record, as well as their first Grammy in 1995 for Best Metal Performance, and also hitting #1 on the Billboard's mainstream rock radio chart and staying there for 7 weeks. It's also a fairly long album with 15 tracks clocking in at 70 minutes long, and I think they really managed to pull off the very difficult task of having a long album that is completely consistent from front to back and offers the listener such high quality tracks that are all distinct and unique in their own ways. And to me, that just makes this album breeze by with one incredible song after the next. Starting with the opening track, Let Me Drown, which brings things in on a nice, badass, energetic vibe, very hard-hitting and groovy guitar and drum parts, great intense high vocals from Chris in the chorus, and a very colorful and contrasting bridge that sets up the guitar solo very nicely. Really amazing opener. And then it is followed by My Wave, a very groovy track in 5/4, showing the utilization of odd time signatures, which we had heard on the previous album, and we will hear that much more on this one as well. And I think a song like this, again, is a great example of Chris's amazing ability to write really natural feeling vocal melodies over odd meters. I love the guitar layering in the chorus as well. Such great guitar writing on this song and just all throughout this album. Then after that, we have one of the hit songs from this album, Fell on Black Days. Absolutely incredible song, a song that would easily make my top 10 favorite Soundgarden tracks. I really love Chris's control of his vocal dynamics throughout this song, being able to sound very mellow and subdued, but then go effortlessly into those really high, intense vocal parts. Just another great banger of a song, and that is followed by Mailman, one of a couple of songs that Matt Cameron wrote on here. A really awesome song, on the slower side tempo-wise, but really groovy, amazing vocals by Chris, and I really love that little falsetto note that he slides into during the verses. That one little note adds so much to this song for me. It's almost my favorite part of the song. And then that is followed by the title track, Superunknown, a nice pickup and energy from the previous track. Once again, amazing vocals from Chris. And I think throughout this album, it features Chris's probably best vocal performances of any Soundgarden album. He just sounds completely on the top of his game all throughout this. Then we go into an amazing Ben Shepherd track titled Head Down. And I will also say, I think this is another Soundgarden song that is criminally underrated. This is actually one of my favorite tracks from this album, and I would say the unsung hero of Superunknown. I feel like a lot of people sleep on this song, but I think this song has such an awesome intensity to it. The way the guitar parts and the vocal melodies work together creates such a powerful sound, and it has this sort of ominous and mysterious quality to it that I just love so much. This would probably make my top 3 favorite songs on this album. Believe it or not, I know that's going to surprise some people, but I would recommend just listen to it a few more times and give it a chance because I think it really will grow on you. So up to this point, we are only 6 songs in and we've already been hit with so much amazing music. And then just to kick things up even further, we have 2 of their biggest hits back to back with Black Hole Sun and Spoon Man. I don't think you could have 2 better songs following each other on any Soundgarden album. Black Hole Sun is arguably one of the most memorable songs of the 90s, and being someone who grew up in the 90s, I have such vivid memories of hearing this song on the radio and being so intrigued at how unique it sounded, and was probably my earliest experience ever hearing Soundgarden. And this would be the song that would end up hitting #1 on the billboards for them, and rightfully so, because this is a perfect song. And then Spoon Man is another one of their most classic songs of all time. Great guitar riffs in 7, once again utilizing the odd time signatures, and this was the lead single for the album and also the track that got them the Grammy in 1995 for Best Metal Performance. After that, we go into a track written by Chris and Kim called Limo Wreck. And here's another song that I feel like is pretty underrated from this album. I've always found the guitar parts particularly interesting on this one. I love the way that they're layered, very tasteful use of harmonics, and very interesting timing as well. For me, it's one of those songs where it can be kind of hard to determine where the beginning of some of the phrases are happening. So just a very cool song that kind of makes your head spin a little bit. And that is followed by The Day I Tried to Live, another really standout track from this album. And like I said earlier, I think it's really mind-blowing how great every single song on this album has been up to this point. Very rare for an album to be this consistent all the way through. One of the reasons why I think this is one of the most exceptional albums and the best grunge album ever made. After that, we have a short 1.5-minute song with music written by Kim titled Kickstand, and I think the placement of this track is absolutely perfect because we've had a handful of tracks that are on the slower side tempo-wise, and then this song just provides a really nice burst of energy for the last chunk of the album, which starts with another Matt Cameron song titled Fresh Tendrils, a nice groovy mid-tempo song in 6/4, and that is followed by my favorite track of the ending part of the album, 4th of July, a song about an acid trip that Chris had around Independence Day, and I just really love those low and dreary chords in the guitar and the way Chris's vocals are recorded and layered against it. The down-tuned guitars create such a nice foundation for Chris's darker vocal parts just to flourish over. Then we have the other Ben Shepherd song on here titled Half, a very interesting 2-minute and 15-second track that has this interesting melding of Indian sorts of sounds with the tabla drums and cello combined with these distorted grungy guitar riffs. Ben is doing lead vocals as well on this one, which provides an interesting contrast from all of the other vocal parts that we've heard from Chris. And I think placing this track second to last was very effective because I think this is definitely the most different sounding track from everything else that we've heard, but I still think that it works and I still really enjoy it as a song on this. And then the album concludes with an amazing 7-minute track titled Like Suicide, a mid-tempo track that Chris had written about a small bird that had snapped its neck while Chris was writing, and Chris actually had to put the bird out of its misery, which gave him the inspiration for this song. I love the guitar parts on this one. I love how the drum groove is mostly centered around the toms and the snare, and it only uses the cymbals sparingly, and then when the cymbals do come in, it just provides such a nice contrast and feels so satisfying. And the intense second half of the track wraps things up on a nice hard-hitting and badass note, very similar to what we got with the opening track. So as you can see, I have nothing but good things to say about this album. Definitely one of my favorite albums of the 90s, and in my opinion, the best grunge album of all time, and ultimately the album that really put Soundgarden on the map and propelled them into levels of success and recognition that they had not experienced up to that point. And unfortunately, shortly after the release of this album, Kurt Cobain would tragically pass away, and it would create this dark cloud within the midst of all of the success that the band was experiencing. So it was undeniably a very weird and difficult time for the band, filled with a lot of highs and a lot of lows, and the band had already had a hard enough time dealing with the death of Andrew Wood from Mother Love Bone, so now Kurt was just another very sad and tough thing for the band to have to endure. So in the midst of the tragedies that would happen before and after this album, I think they delivered their greatest release of their career, my favorite Soundgarden album. This one gets an easy S. All right, now we have their 5th studio album from 1996 titled Down on the Upside, and I'm going to give this one an A. I think this is a very good album, but I wouldn't say that it matches up to the previous 2 releases. In terms of overall consistency and quality of tracks, a lot of people consider this to be sort of a sequel to Superunknown, but in a slightly downgraded fashion, and I tend to agree with that, but I still think it's a great album, and it is significantly better than their first 2 releases, in my opinion. Similar to Superunknown, it's very long with 16 tracks at 65 minutes in length. It opens up with Pretty Noose, which is an incredible opener and probably my favorite track on here as well. Really tasty guitar grooves and a great showcase of Chris's amazingly high and intense vocal parts. Just such hard-hitting vocals throughout this track. And then that is followed by Rhinosaur, a groovy song with some nice guitar riffs and catchy vocal parts. And then we go into 3 tracks where the music was written by Ben Shepherd, starting with Zero Chance and then Dusty and then Ty Cobb. Zero Chance Advance is a bit more on the mellow and chill side. I love the chord progression and the guitars on this one, and a great contrast between the instrumental and vocal sections. Probably my favorite of the string of 3 Ben Shepherd songs. Then we have Dusty, a very effectively placed track with that great blend of chillness and intensity between the 2 sections. I particularly love the chorus of this song. I think it hits really hard. And then that is followed by Ty Cobb, which really brings the energy up and gets pretty heavy. Chris's vocals are awesome and intense on this one. And as you can see, up to this point, I really don't dislike any of the songs on here. The main thing that I would say that differentiates between this and Superunknown is just the quality of the songs. I think the majority of the songs on here are good, but at the same time, I don't think there are as many really exceptional and standout tracks in comparison to Superunknown and Badmotorfinger. After that, we have a Chris Cornell song titled Blow Up the Outside World. I absolutely love this song. The contrast from section to section is very powerful. When the chorus comes in, it just hits so hard. Amazing vocal work by Chris. Another standout track on here for me, definitely. Then we have another Chris song titled Burden in My Hand, a nice solid rock song, which is followed by another Ben Shepherd track titled Never Named. I've never been particularly crazy about this one. This has always been one of the few skip-over tracks on this album for me, which is another thing that differentiates it from the previous 2 and why I do consider it to be a little bit of a downgrade. It does have a couple of skip-over tracks for me. After that, we have the second Matt Cameron track titled Apple Bite. I love this song. I think it has a really mysterious and ominous sort of mood to it between the guitar parts, the tempo of the track, and the way that Chris's vocals are recorded and mixed. Such a great song to mix up the vibe at this point in the album. Then we have the one Kim song on here titled Never the Machine Forever. A really cool, hard-hitting song in 9. Another great example of their ability to write odd meter riffs that are really catchy and feel natural. So what I will say now is, for me, at this point in the album, it has reached its peak. I do think that the momentum does die down a good amount. After that, we have 2 tracks that were originally written for Superunknown, Tighter and Tighter and No Attention. I love Tighter and Tighter. I think that song has a great vibe and it grooves really hard and builds really nicely throughout. But No Attention is a song I've never been crazy about, probably my least favorite track on the album, and I think they could have done without this just on the album altogether. I think if they left it out, it would have made an improvement. And from No Attention and onward, I do think that the ending piece of the album is probably the weakest. I'm not too crazy about the remainder of the tracks, with the exception of Overfloater, which I do enjoy a lot. But Switch Opens and Unkind and Boot Camp are all sort of whatever tracks for me. Nothing really stands out to me in comparison to the stuff that we heard on the first third of the album. So as you can see, I do like a lot of this album, but I do have some critiques, and I do think there are some dips in momentum throughout, and it doesn't have the same consistency or exceptional quality of tracks that the previous 2 albums do. But for being an album with the impossible task of following up Superunknown, I definitely don't think that they did a bad job on this one, and it still contains a really great handful of tracks that give us a continuation of that sound that they developed from Superunknown. So good album. This one gets an A. Okay, so following the release of Down on the Upside, things had gotten a lot worse in the band's personal lives. They were touring a lot and really overworking themselves. Chris was drinking more and withdrawing from people a lot, and Ben Shepherd was getting more angry and confrontational on stage and would sometimes even leave the stage in the middle of performances. And this would all culminate into a show in Hawaii in 1997 where Ben was having issues with his bass and left the stage, and that was basically the last straw for Chris, and he had decided to end the band, and that was the end of Soundgarden as we knew it. In the following years, Chris would contribute songs to movie soundtracks. He'd write and record multiple solo albums. He would have 3 kids. He started a new supergroup called Audioslave, comprised of him and the instrumentalists of Rage Against the Machine, and they would release 3 albums between 2002 and 2006. And he also dealt with some darker periods as well, with an alcohol and painkiller addiction, the death of Lane Staley of Alice in Chains in 2002, his divorce from his wife in 2004, and ultimately he would become sober thanks to the guys in Audioslave really looking out for him. So as you can see, Chris did stay busy during this period, and no one had suspected that Soundgarden would ever reunite again after so many years of nothing going on. But after 13 years apart, they had finally decided to play together again, and that had culminated into them playing at some festivals and setting up a tour, as well as them going through the archives and reissuing some old albums and some previously unreleased tracks. As they started spending more and more time together, they started to get back into the writing process, and at a certain point it did become clear that they were going to be releasing a new album, which would eventually turn into this, which is their sixth and final studio album from 2012 titled King Animal. And I gotta say, of all six of these albums, this was the one that I really struggled with the most to come up with a fitting score for. I went back and forth for a while, and ultimately I decided to give it an A, but it really teetered between A and B for quite a long time. But the more I thought about it and the more I looked at the ratio of good songs to not good songs, I think A did make the most sense for me. I wouldn't say that I like it as much as Down on the Upside either, but I definitely still think it is better than Louder Than Love and Ultra Mega OK. I think for Soundgarden to release a return album after 13 years of not playing together, certainly the expectations are going to be high, and I think that this album turned out surprisingly good. A lot of times return albums don't always culminate into a really good piece of work, but I think in this case, they did a great job of keeping the essence of that Soundgarden sound that we all know and love, but still incorporated new sounds and surprised us with some songs that do sound like a new and refined Soundgarden. And I think in terms of the production and the types of songs that they wrote, they really did a great job of creating an album that was true to who they were, but also fitting for the time that it was released in as well. It doesn't sound stale to me at all. It opens up with the lead single of the album, Been Away Too Long, a solid opener, not one of my favorites on this album. I know it is a favorite of a lot of other people's, but I think it's a good track. It brings everything in with a really nice energy, and as soon as you hear Chris's vocals, it's clear that his voice is still in incredible shape. He still has that great intensity, and he's hitting those classic Chris Cornell high notes with such ease. Really great way to bring everything in. Then we go into Non-State Actor, and I know a lot of people love this song, but for me, this has always been one of the tracks on here that I'm sort of indifferent about. There are a couple of instrumental parts that I think are cool, but as an overall song, definitely not one of the standout tracks on here for me, and probably my least favorite song of the first half of the album. I do really love when Chris screams on that song, though, I gotta say that. But then after that, we have one of my favorite songs on here titled By Crooked Steps. This was the second single from the album, and it's just an absolutely amazing, badass, and hard-hitting song. Really tasty guitar grooves with interesting meters going on, and to me this is one of the songs on here that is the most reminiscent of the Superunknown period, which is probably the main reason why I love it so much. Then we have a very cool song titled 1,000 Days Before, which has some great musical writing from Kim, a lot of cool world music flavors sprinkled into this song, and I think this one is a great example of one of those songs that was surprising to hear and showed us a new side of Soundgarden that sounded very fresh and refined. After that, we have Blood on the Valley Floor, which is another one with music written by Kim. Another very cool and groovy song reminiscent of that classic Soundgarden era. And then that is followed by hands down my favorite track on here titled Bones of Birds, an absolutely incredible Chris Cornell track. I love the chord progression in the guitar, and Chris's vocal melody is so beautifully haunting. Such a great use of dynamics throughout the song. It just has everything that I love about Soundgarden in one track. Then we have Terry, which is a Ben Shepherd track that he had been sitting on and was originally going to release on a solo record. And for me, this is another one of those tracks that I'm sort of indifferent about, kind of a skip over track. And there are a few of those kinds of tracks throughout this album for me, which is another reason why I do like Down on the Upside a little bit more. But there's only a couple, and I do think that the strong songs on here are so good that they really do carry the album. The next song, Attrition, is another one that I'm not crazy about, unfortunately. Kind of just a boring, generic sounding rock song in my opinion. But then we have another incredible Chris Cornell track titled Black Saturday. Another one of the standout tracks on here for me, really tasteful acoustic guitar parts with some nice hand percussion and some very interesting harmonic movements in the guitars, a lot of really great tense chord voicings that resolve really nicely. I love how the drums come in on the second verse and Chris's vocals go up the octave as well, really adds to the intensity of the song. Then we have another track that I find kind of boring halfway there, another one that to me just sounds kind of like a generic generic rock song. But luckily after that, I do enjoy the last 3 tracks on here with Worst Dreams, Eyelids Mouth, and Rowing. With the exception of Rowing, I wouldn't say that the other 2 are like really exceptional tracks from the album, but I do think that they are good and they do end the album on a high note. Rowing in particular is such a cool song, super catchy vocal parts and a really tasteful groove on that slower tempo side, and the way it builds into that final guitar solo and then brings the dynamics back down is a very satisfying way to conclude the final track of the final Soundgarden album. So as you can see, I think the majority of this album is very strong. It does have a few tracks that are skip overs for me, but I think that the good songs are very strong and do make up for the couple of dips in momentum throughout. And I know some people regard this as one of the worst Soundgarden albums, but for me, I do find that this is one of their albums that does get better the more that you listen to it. So if you don't like this album, I would recommend giving it a few more listens, and I think it might grow on you a little bit more like it did with me. So not a bad final album at all. I'll give this one an A. Alright, so that covers all 6 of their studio albums, and as most people listening are probably aware of, they had actually been working on new material in 2017 and had plans of releasing a 7th album, but unfortunately we had to have the very sad and unexpected suicide of Chris Cornell in May of 2017, which I think no one saw coming and was one of the toughest musician deaths of the past 10 years, at least for me anyway. So it's very sad that Chris left us way too soon, and it would have been great to hear what a 7th Soundgarden album would have sounded like, but the amount of great music that they've left the world cannot be overstated. Like I said in the beginning, they are my favorite grunge band, and they have released some of my favorite music of the 90s. And while I don't love every single song or even every album that they have released, the strong albums and songs are about as of high quality of music that anyone can create, in my opinion. So, incredible band. And that's it. That is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you came away with some new knowledge about the band and their music and maybe some new songs to check out. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree and how you rank these 6 albums. And if you're interested in checking out my other tier lists, they will be linked in the description as well as the comments. So be sure to look through that and see if there's anything else that you like. And that's about it. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.